So, whether your focus is infrastructure as code or you're preparing for a Microsoft security exam, securing Azure storage is an area you have to master. And today I'm joined by DevOps guru Ryan Arujo, and we'll do some show and tell on the key aspects of securing Azure storage, along with some tips for the AZ-500 security exam to ensure you're feeling ready on game day. Let's get started. All right, so we are back for day 105 of Infrastructure as Code in Azure. So this is the 100 more days of Infrastructure as Code in Azure. If you're an AZ-500 exam preparation person, this is going to be a great session for you because we're going end to end on security for Azure storage. And I've brought back my usual partner in crime, Ryan Arujo. Ryan?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me, Pete.
Yeah, my pleasure. And in evening, I think, is putting it mildly. I think it's now officially morning in Austria, yeah?
It is officially Halloween.
Oh, wow.
Right now.
All right. Happy Halloween to you. May you have a socially distanced and enjoyable Halloween.
Indeed.
Thank you. Folks, we're going to go end to end on Azure storage here. So this is going to be great, whether you're an infrastructure as code or a DevOps person really wanting to just understand all the ways you can secure Azure storage, or if you're preparing for a security exam or a DevOps exam. So there's going to be a little something for everybody. So Ryan, what do you say we deploy something?
Absolutely, Pete. So I've already shared my screen. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to kick off, and we're going to deploy a resource group in our target subscription using the Azure CLI. If this isn't your first time visiting our demonstrations on YouTube, you'll notice that we do prefer Azure CLI for most of our demos, but everything you can do here can be done with Azure PowerShell, ARM templates, and REST API if you are really so inclined. Our resource group is now deployed, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to generate a random 4-digit number. So we ensure that our storage account that we're about to create is unique.
And it's great that Ryan's showing you this, especially if you're somebody setting up CI/CD pipelines or you're setting up infrastructure as code. This 4-digit randomization is going to be really important because your storage accounts need a unique name. When you get over into Azure SQL, your accounts need a unique name. You're going to use this again and again and again.
Correct. And so as you can see here, we have appended the random alpha variable at the end of the name of our storage account called the next 100 days str. We are deploying this into our resource group we just deployed into Western Europe using standard LRS redundancy, SKU, storage v2, and the output of the result of this process that is running. The output's going to be in table format. You have the option to output either no output, JSON in color, table, and TSV as well. And I remember correctly earlier, I think we were discussing whether we should use a different type of output here. You can see that the output here is less than readable at this time because there's a lot of information being returned from the table format. But that's neither here nor there in this particular case. We can see that it was deployed successfully. We see that the status of our primary is available and the provisioning state is succeeded. We'll ensure that the day 105 in GitHub will have a more cleaner output option for you here. So now if we kick on over to our 100 days, or excuse me, to our resource groups and our subscription, we're going to browse to the next 100 days str resource group, and we see our storage account, and it is ready to go.
There we go. So why don't we just let's just go right down the list, Ryan. Why don't we start with identity and access management and just talk about our roles. So least privilege is something we're always striving for, folks, right? And you're going to find that if you're out there in the real world trying to build, trying to implement a secure solution, understanding which roles you need to assign achieve different objectives, to assign different permissions is going to be really important. And for an exam, you're quite likely to be tested on these roles in a least privileged scenario. So you notice Ryan's browsed down to the storage roles here. So if we think about storage account contributor, so we know at a global level, if we're talking about a subscription, remember when you're assigning roles, you have the scope as well, right? So I can assign things at a management group or a subscription or a resource group, or all the way down at the resource level. And the contributor role, generally speaking, is a role that can do anything in the given scope except assign permissions to other people. And so storage account contributor is a scoped version of that contributor capability. So if Ryan gave me storage account contributor, I can do just about anything in this context except assign permissions to my peers. And Ryan moused over the check access. So for your Microsoft exams in particular, and I know AZ-500, I think this even showed up in the skills measured if memory served. The check access is a great way to check permissions for a single security principal. So if I just need to quickly see, what are my permissions or permissions of user X, this is the way I can check their assignments quickly and easily. So that's your use case for check access. But with your RBAC, remember, you need to know those native roles. You need to know your scope, and you're going to want to put your hands on touching on creating a custom role. So Ryan, why don't we talk about access when we're not dealing with a user and a logon? Let's talk about keys and access signatures.
Absolutely. So for the access keys, if we go down here under the primary blade, under access keys, you can see we have two keys and 2 connection strings. And a way to quickly retrieve these keys from a programmatic standpoint, which may become useful to you later, is something we're going to go over here in just a second. But we wanted to note that under normal circumstances, if you had something you need to quickly copy and paste to use this key in for a connection string or something else, you have that option available to you to just quickly copy to your clipboard. Using these actual keys in a CI/CD pipeline is a little more complicated. So I'm going to click back over here into my Cloud Shell. And I'm going to list the account keys here in raw JSON format. I'm going to do it in color so it's a little bit more visible. And you'll see that we are returned the same information that we have available to us in the Azure portal. Again, key names, the permissions that they're granted, and the values of each of those keys.
And remember for your exams, folks, so Ryan's going to give you the transcript here in the show notes. So over in the GitHub repo for day 105, whether you're studying for an exam or you're just working on your CI/CD skills, if you haven't worked with the Azure CLI, you want to get comfortable with these. You can definitely be tested on Azure CLI commands or PowerShell on your Microsoft exams, both for security and for DevOps. So Ryan, what's the downside of overusing these access keys?
Overusing them, well, you don't have a standard way of managing, so to speak, how these keys are regenerated over time. So if you were going to, if you were going to, for instance, reuse these keys a lot. Yep. In your automation, you need to bake something in your automation that's ensuring that you're constantly pulling either the latest version of these keys that are available, or whatever you're using that is for using these keys to access a storage account. You would want a standard way of ensuring that the keys are regenerated on a regular basis as well. So
Ryan brings up an important point here. So you need to manage your key rotation. So In terms of scoping permissions with an access key, Ryan, what are my options here? If I give somebody this key, what are the permissions they have, and what does limit their permissions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This just gives carte blanche access to the storage account. Yeah, for the queues, the files, blobs, containers, file shares. Yeah, it gives carte blanche access across the board.
Yeah, so remember, folks, when you're dealing with questions on an exam where multiple answers look like they're possible, you always want to pick the best answer, the most secure answer, right? And so what Ryan just described there is that these keys are going to give whomever you hand them to root access in perpetuity until we roll the keys. We'll talk about key rotation in a bit. So Ryan, if I want to grant someone access to get into my storage, particularly someone maybe working with my DevOps team, or maybe somebody external to my organization that doesn't have a login, what's another option besides a key I could use?
Sure, absolutely. Shared access signatures. And back here in the Azure portal, I've gone into the main blade again, and under shared access signature here, you'll notice that you have a lot of options for how you want to configure access to whichever services and resource types within the storage account, and also the amount of time that they have access to said resources. So going from the top down, we're going to leave the defaults in here and just quickly go over what is being allowed access. So for the default shared access signature that's filled in here in the form, essentially, blob, file, queue, and tables are all accessible. We could scope it down to a resource type to be a specific service, container, or object. We're allowing all permissions across the board, which is essentially carte blanche. Also allowing people access to enable deleted versions of blobs. So, or excuse me, enables the deletion of the versions themselves. So that would ensure if there's something in there that you wanted temporarily deleted, the person with the temporary access could just annihilate whatever's left. From a start and expiration time here, you'll notice that we have a default time frame of 8 hours. Halloween 2020, at least over here, the beginning of Halloween until 8 o'clock in the morning. If you're using Azure, Pete, help me out here for a second. Azure Storage Explorer.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Azure Storage Explorer. The default time frame in there is 24 hours. So just be aware of that if you're using the defaults. We can also determine which time zone we want this to apply to, and also which IP addresses we want to provide access to. So you can lock it down, not just the permissions, but also the location that someone could actually use the SAS token from.
So we can do, for IP addresses, we can do IPs, we can do ranges, and I believe we can do CIDR blocks there.
Correct.
As well.
Yep. Last couple of things in here, you'll notice that we have protocols by default HTTPS only. We recommend going HTTPS only. Do not use HTTP unless you have a damn good reason to do so. Default routing here is left in place. And go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, and we'll talk about how we can restrict access at the network level. So. But routing, you're not going to touch. Really think of, generally speaking, we're touching access from a network level when we're trying to just restrict access from the internet, or from lock it down to specific subnets, right?
Correct, and that would be the case that you'd have Microsoft network routing would pop up in here, as it states here. We would have to have something under firewalls and virtual networks for these options to even become available for us.
Yeah. So and then what Ryan's creating here, technically, he's at the storage account level. So when we're creating a shared access signature or a SAS, we'd call this an account SAS, because we're creating a shared access signature at the level of the storage account. Now, if he were to go a level down, say down to a blob or a queue or a table or a file down to a service, we'd call that a service SaaS. So if I'm down at a specific service level like a blob, I'm now restricting and tuning at a lower level. So, but even here at the account level, Ryan can lock it down to just blobs, for example, but he can lock it down to any blob at the account level, right? So multiple blobs or multiple queues or multiple tables.
Correct.
So it's much like RBAC in that respect, that we have scopes, right? So the level matters. So Ryan, I wonder if this might not be a good opportunity for me to talk about stored access policies.
Absolutely. Fire away, mister.
So this is something that I find folks don't know about. This well could come up, particularly on the AZ-500 exam. And if you're a frequent user of SaaS, stored access policies are something you should know about. So stored access policies basically give us an additional level of control over service level shared access signatures. So we were talking about account level SaaS, right, where we're creating it at the account level. So what I'll do is I'll go down a level deeper, and with a stored access policy, I can establish a way to just group my my shared access signatures and provide additional restrictions for signatures that are bound to this policy. So I can use a stored access policy to change start time, expiry time, etc. I can make changes to the stored access policy that affect the SaaS that were generated from it. Very, very cool. So let me just pull up an Azure portal screen, and we'll just create a stored access policy and see that in action.
And while Pete's doing that, I'm going to mention in here that there's going to be a couple of additional items that are available to you for the automation we were discussing earlier. They may use for retrieving and managing storage account keys that will be in day 105 in the transcript. Pete, please.
Cool, thanks, sir. All right, so I'm in a storage account. So I went to the Azure portal, I went to Azure Storage, I'm looking at a storage account, and I'm going to click on containers. So I'm looking at blob storage. And now that I am down here at the service level, I can create a service level access policy here. So I'll click into my container. I'm going to go to access policy. And now I'm going to create a service level SaaS. So if I click add policy, I'm creating here a set of parameters to provide a specific type of access. So I'll call this Halloween access policy. So I'm creating my stored access policy. I'm going to give it read only. I'm going to make it good for a day with my start and expiry time. I'll leave the time zone as it is for those purposes. And so now I've created, and let me just expand this for you. I've got a couple of them here just in case I get a little crazy with one, but you see I created one earlier here. Here's what I want to show you about SaaS, because with shared access signatures, Ryan may have said this already, when you create a SaaS, you have to copy it right then, right? Because you can't come back and get it later. So with a stored access policy, I can come back here and edit, and I can change the parameters of this policy. I can make keys available good for longer or shorter, and I can control the parameters around, under which those keys generated from this operate. So maybe I create a stored access policy that's good for a year, but then I realize, oh my gosh, that's way too long. I can come back in and make it expire yesterday, and I invalidate any SaaS that was created from it. And now you may ask, well, how do I generate a SaaS from a stored access policy? Let's just we'll pop back up to the account. I'll go to Storage Explorer, and you'll find that Azure Storage Explorer, there's a preview integrated in the Azure portal now, which is very cool. So let me just show you one way that I could generate a SaaS from that stored access policy. So here's my blob storage. So I'm looking at the types of storage in my account, right? I'll expand blob. Here's that container I was working with. I'm going to right click that container, And I want you to notice here it says I can get a shared access signature. When I click on that, it's going to allow me to pick a stored access policy. So I can lock it down. I can lock users' permissions down so they can't go create net new SaaS. They can just generate SaaS from the stored access policies I give them. I can whittle things down here to make it very, but I'm also making this very easy for people, right? So there's a convenience factor here that I'll pick my Halloween access policy. You'll notice here that it has read. So I don't have to think about what permissions I needed because my administrator already crafted that in the policy. So I hit create. That gives me my URI and my query string. I can copy that and go to town at that point, and that's all there is to it. So know what a stored access policy is for AZ-500 in particular. I saw something in skills measured or in some study materials there, and I know I've had at least one person comment they saw something related to that on the exam out in the public space in one of our many LinkedIn learning discussions. So make sure you give that a look. Ryan, why don't you take over for a minute and show us resource firewalls?
Sure, absolutely.
This is another one that you're definitely going to want to know when you're securing your infrastructure in a DevOps context and an infrastructure as code scenario. But for AZ-500 in particular, I expect resource firewalls are going to come. It's anybody's guess what service they may come up with. I do see it mentioned frequently with storage and with Azure SQL, though.
Absolutely. So in our main blade again, under the settings section of our storage account, we're under firewalls and virtual networks. By default, everything is going to have access to our storage account. If we want to whittle this down to restrict access, we would choose selected networks, and then we would have the option to either add an existing virtual network or a new virtual network. And by adding from an existing virtual network, which we have none in here actually, the important part is this. If you have multiple subnets within each of your VNets, you have the option to choose either one, all of them, or a few. So you can pare down specifically which subnets of each VNet you want to have access to your storage account. On top of that, you also have the option to add in, for instance, your client IP address, your public IP address from where you're sitting from, or if you have IP addresses of your clients, your customers, other employees, and you know where they're working remotely from, or they need remote access, you would add their IP address or their IP address range in here as well.
Because remember, your storage accounts by default are accessible from the internet, right?
Correct, across the board.
So I can come in here and I can restrict access and make sure that my my firewalls my storage accounts are not accessible from the internet if that's what I want to do. Correct.
The last thing I'd like to mention in here, besides you have some other options in here as well that you may want to take a look at. Be aware that for the most part, the service firewalls and VNet, virtual network configurations are almost identical across all the services. Hubs, PostgreSQL, MySQL, MS SQL, storage accounts, across the board, it's almost identical. So if you're wondering, like, if you're planning how to restrict access to a lot of to all of your resources in an Azure resource group or an Azure subscription, chances are you would want to have some type of automated or controlled policy whereby you're controlling the firewalls and virtual networks for all of these resources in almost the same fashion to make it easier for you to manage. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, and the exceptions there you want to be familiar with come exam time as well, because you'll notice you can make exceptions here to allow access to trusted Microsoft services, to read access for storage logging from any network. So you have some options there that, from a manageability perspective, might factor. So Ryan, can we pop back up to the account level and have a look at logging for a moment?
Sure.
So if we look at, say, the activity log, or let's go with the activity log. So when Ryan pops into diagnostic settings here, from a security perspective, you might be quizzed on your knowledge of where you can send logs for later analysis. And you've got three destinations for your logs, and Ryan's showing you right here over there under destination details. You'll see that we can send to log analytics, we can send to a storage account, or we can send to the last one in that list there, which is an event hub. You'll see the event hub come up in a scenario where maybe you're going to send the data off to a third-party service. If you're going to send it off to, say, a third-party security information event management tool, if you weren't using Azure Sentinel yet, for example. So no log analytics, storage account, and event hub as destinations for your logging when you're thinking about security in that context. Let's see here. So Ryan, I wanted to take control from you here and talk to folks briefly about what we would call legal hold. So the key distinction with a legal hold is that the storage becomes immutable, meaning it cannot be deleted. And not only can it not be deleted, it cannot be changed. So we essentially mark that legal hold. We put a case number or ticket number on there, because typically we're putting a legal hold on something because there are legal proceedings related to the data on this storage. So remember, legal hold means cannot delete, and you cannot change the data on that storage either. So remember that legal hold, folks. I'm just quickly going to show you where you set that legal hold on a container. So I'll just pop into that same storage account where we looked at stored access policies. I'm going to go to my container. And when I go to access policy, there's a section titled Immutable Blob Storage. So if I click Add Policy here, I can set time-based retention, which allows me to set a retention period on this. So this will remain in place for that given duration at minimum. And then legal hold, which basically I have to put a tag in here like a case ID, etc. At which point I'm locking this down for the long term while we resolve that issue. So let's talk about Azure Files. So Azure Files comes up a fair bit, and there's something I want to share with you all here. So Azure Files comes up pretty frequently because that was a long-awaited feature, and Azure Files replaces, in some use cases, your on-premises file server. So one of the questions you may get on the exam, understanding that when it comes to any Microsoft exam around Azure or any other service, they're going to test you on the shiny new useful features, right? So Azure AD Authentication is one of those shiny, relatively new, in the grand scheme of Azure, useful features. And when we couple that with Azure Files, you could get some questions around, say, what types of storage support Azure AD Authentication. So I've got a chart here. This is in the AZ-500 exam, Ultimate Exam Prep Guide. It's authorizing access to your Azure storage, and you'll notice here that this table has the types of storage, and then it has the types of access and whether they are supported or they are not supported. And for Azure Active Directory, you're going to notice that blobs support Azure AD. You're going to notice that queues support Azure AD. And blobs and queues support Azure AD Authentication. You'll notice that Azure Files do not support authentication, and you're going to be confused by this potentially. This is maybe the most common discussion I have around storage in Azure AD Authentication. Why does it say no for files? I'm sure that it does support it. Well, your Azure files support Azure AD domain services authentication. So you want to lay your hands on Azure AD domain services, at least conceptually be familiar with that. And if you go over to my AZ-500 training over on LinkedIn Learning, I've got 2 or 3 videos around storage, and one of those drills down and talks about your Azure files and Azure AD domain services. So no, for the exam, blobs and queues support Azure AD auth, and if you're talking about Azure files, it's Azure AD domain services. A couple other things I wanted to touch on here. In fact, just one more thing on my list, Ryan. We've been knocking this out fast. I wanted to talk to you all about something Ryan brought up. He said, key rotation matters. Okay, so with your storage accounts, you want to rotate your keys. So I'm going to pop over to another. Wow, just blanked out there. Let me just take a drink of coffee here, and we'll try that again.
No worries.
Take 2. So we can automate rotating our storage account keys using Azure Key Vault, and you're going to find 2 documents out in the show notes. One is managing your storage account keys with Azure Key Vault and PowerShell. The other shows you how to set this up with Azure CLI. So both of these are equally viable. And at the end of the day, you're basing your Key Vault access to those keys, and you're leveraging managed identities. Now, there's a scenario that may come up where maybe you can't use managed identities, and in that case, there's another way to do this, and I'm just going to show you the diagram here. So if managed identities aren't an option, Microsoft has another way. I wouldn't sweat this too much. For the exam, I would go touch managing your storage account keys with Key Vault, because Microsoft recommends, and I'm going to show you the purple box right in the middle of the article here. Actually, I'm going to show you the little box in the middle of this one. So in one of these, there's a little note that says use Key Vault and don't interfere with other mechanisms for automating this. I can't find it because I want to show it to you, so I'll slap it on the screen, and we'll put it up in post-production. But know that Microsoft recommends that you manage your storage account key rotation using Azure Key Vault, and there's no other way they recommend. So know that when you walk in the door for game day. So Ryan, rolling all the way back to deploy, I want to just tie this off, and we'll call it a night for you. You were deploying with Azure CLI. What other deployment mechanisms do we have for Azure storage?
Absolutely. Yes, Pete, you have the option to deploy using Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, ARM templates, and heck, REST API too, if you're so inclined. You have several methods at your disposal. And the Azure portal, of course. The Azure portal, that was the last one.
Yeah. So for those of you that are really here more exam focused, Ryan and I this will be the 105th day of infrastructure as code in Azure. So we have lots of code artifacts that will show you how to deploy storage in different ways. So Azure CLI was here today. We'll have links for and artifacts for PowerShell, for ARM templates. ARM templates being both idempotent and declarative. And for those of you that are interested in what's the best way to deploy something in an automated way and a repetitive way when we think about CI/CD. An ARM template is both idempotent and it's declarative, which means if I try to deploy something more than one time, it's always going to result in the same set of artifacts deployed. So if I run an ARM template, if I deploy an ARM template twice, I don't get the 2 copies of the same storage account. It just takes care of anything I might have deleted on accident, for example. Ryan was using Azure CLI, and I like Azure CLI for 2 reasons over PowerShell. The first is it allows me to provide a friendly way for cross-platform, like Linux, Bash, Python developers to come into my scripting world, right? Because I can use Azure CLI and Bash scripts. Great for folks that are working on Linux today. Azure CLI also happens to be idempotent. So if Ryan ran his command a second time, it would actually see that the storage account was already there and it wouldn't try to create it again. Which means that Azure CLI has a strategic advantage, at least in its create commands, because it's those create commands in Azure CLI that are idempotent. Azure PowerShell is neither declarative nor idempotent. So, but not to say that you shouldn't use PowerShell. If PowerShell is your bag, if it's your bag, baby, use it, right? It's fine. To each their own. So folks, really, we've touched on, in the span of half an hour here, just a wide range of things that you maybe tested on your Azure security or DevOps exams, and certainly there's some food for thought here if you're somebody building, that CI/CD strategy for your organization. So Ryan, as always, I so appreciate you coming and joining us, and especially at midnight.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again, Pete. We'll do this again, and it won't be Halloween for sure. We know that much.
We will get you back here before the end of next week, I have a feeling. So folks, that's it for this installment. So good luck on your exams or your CI/CD. Make sure you reach out to us on LinkedIn, on the GitHub repo through comments. Ryan, before we cut bait here, why don't you tell us where we can find you on social media?
Absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn and or on Twitter at REIRUJO.
And he is the only Ryan Arujo that I've ever encountered, so easy guy to find. All right, Ryan, thanks again for joining us. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Pete. Have a good one.
And that's it for day 105. Do make sure you grab the show notes so you have access to all the articles we've mentioned and the code artifacts. If you have questions, reach out on LinkedIn or give us a comment on the GitHub repo. Good luck on your exams, and we'll see you in the next video.